So my name is Chuck Buffum, and I work for Knurld. Knurld is a young company, a recent startup to commercialize technology from a parent company called Analyst that did a bunch of government research. So we come out of the very noisy speech processing environment, military battlefield kind of stuff, and then to take that to market. That translates into a product today. For a 3-month-old company, we have our first product, and we're doing text-dependent active voice biometric authentication. But think like inline on a laptop. And where we're headed to this summer is a text-independent passive technology also, but primarily focused in the home automation and connected car world, which is, I think, what gets us into the IoT session.
Eligibility.
Yeah.
Fantastic, yeah. So Tristan Prince, I'm the Business Development Manager for iovation in the UK and Europe. iovation, rather than looking at personal data, what iovation like to look at is device, because we believe that device can tell you a lot about either the person behind the transaction, where the transaction is originating from, and even give you a history of how that device performing said transaction has performed in the past. So iovation has in excess of 3 billion devices we've captured, cross-sector, cross-international border, and because we don't rely on personal data, just device data, our clients share evidence on devices. So we have 30 million records of fraud down to account takeovers, identity thefts, chargebacks, all shared by our clients in real time. So the iovation service is designed to give you front door protection and assess device risk. In addition to that, utilising our ability to identify devices also gives the opportunity to authenticate. So device can be used as an invisible factor of authentication without any friction for the customer, but will allow you to identify whether it is the genuine customer.
Which raises the question is like, if I'm carrying one of those devices and I'm moving happily from place to place, and I could use, could your two technologies, could one be over top the other? I mean, you said that you're device only, but then maybe there's an instance where I do want to authenticate, be aware that I am.
Yeah, I think they're compatible.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, always my view when I'm speaking to clients or speaking at events like this, my view is always there's never a silver bullet. You know, there's never going to be something that's going to solve absolutely everything. So I think a layered approach is how you get the best result, not only for your company, but also for your customers. The amount of times, from a biometrics perspective, if all of our customers were sat in quiet rooms that were well lit, with a perfect internet connection and a perfect phone line, then everything's going to function perfectly. But the reality is we're all taking part in life, and life isn't quiet, isn't well lit necessarily. So I think having the two and giving the customer, I think some of the panel members earlier picked up on the point, giving customers the ability to pick and choose which is appropriate for them at that point in time. I think that's key.
Agreed.
Okay, well, so then we get to the set of questions that we discussed a little bit. It strikes me as that we brought up this term of continuous authentication. In other words, as just my being here, having my phone, not having done anything that Dan wouldn't have done anyway, you probably have fairly high confidence that I am who I am. And to be friction-free as I move around and try to authenticate, for some percentage of the activities I might do, I'm already authenticated, right? I don't have to do anything. I ended with an upward inflection. That was my question.
Yeah, well, I mean, sometimes you don't have to do anything, right? One of the things I think that's been pervasive in the last day and a half is that, or been touched on multiple times, if not pervasive, is that authentication ought to be consistent with transactional risk. There should be some intelligence there. And so we have tended historically to authenticate people as they enter the door, whether they're logging in to an IVR, so that one time. And so we're going to put you through 3 degrees or as much as intensity of authentication as we will. And then once you're in, Katie bar the door, you can do anything you want. And so that notion is very 1980s, but we're not in the 80s anymore. And so the notion of dynamically adjusting risk based upon what it is that you're trying to transact and the need to be able to dynamically adjust the degree of authentication at the same time is an important one. And if you can do that, then you can traverse account inquiry, general information, high-risk transactions, low-risk transactions, and only add elements of authentication when they're appropriate. But that's more conceptual than practically implemented, right?
Yes and no. I mean, can it be practically implemented? I mean, I think that's part of, and in what time frame? I mean, because I think in a way it's de facto implemented, and just the fact that some of my bank, or like my bank's app lets me look at stuff on the lock screen, which was unheard of just a year ago, and so I'm authentic enough just because I can do no harm, and they're reasonably confident that I am who I am.
Yeah, I think to that point, really, ultimately, when you're collecting and authenticating a consumer as part of a sign-up process, or when you have the initial opportunity to do it, the point from a consumer perspective is, if you collect that information at that point, are you going to have to answer it again, over and over again?
Right.
And the best customer journey, the ultimate customer journey that we try and push our clients to, using things like device or using other elements, is to not ask for usernames and passwords, because you already know that it's that customer. You know based on their device, you know based on their locational information, you know based on all of the elements that you can capture from that transaction with the customer. So you remove the friction. So then when you get to that point, the customer experience goes up and up and up, because they're transacting with you, they're able to do certain things without friction. To your point though, sometimes stuff does change. So sometimes people's devices will change. Sometimes, as we said, the environment that they're in will change. So it's also, from my perspective, about making the level of authentication that you're giving the customer relevant to the activity that they're performing. So to your point, if you're going to log into an online bank and maybe something about your device has changed, it might still be okay for you to view your account balance, but it's not going to be okay for you to transfer $10,000 to another bank account. So again, it's about matching the level of risk and the activity that the consumer is performing alongside the level of authentication.
And then Chuck raised the issue that, conceptually we're talking about moving around friction-free, and every once in a while we'll hit moments where we do have, something happened and I do. But then there's some question about a couple of things. Like, if I'm authenticating against an identity, and this came up in the last panel, where's that identity coming from? And that's where it would be nice to keep this intelligent discussion in Angel's talk yesterday about islands of identity. I may have 5 or 6 or 7 claimed identities I've heard it in the hundreds for some people, but how do you patch that together?
The interesting thing is, as a consumer, you're kidding yourself if you don't believe that your identity information is out there. The high-profile data breaches that occur consistently, persistently, across sector, so it's not just retailers like big data breaches there. HMRC in the UK have lost data. Companies that are holding large amounts of personal data are losing that data. Therefore, if you're only using identity information, information based on personal data, names, addresses, date of birth, credit card numbers, that information is already out there. If you're a fraudster, you can go on the dark web, you can buy that information. So there's going to be a level as to what information you can use, but it's about, again, going back to that, making the overall risk decision, making sure that you're capturing a number of different elements about that consumer, about where the consumer is located. So geolocation is a great one for understanding risk. Why is the person using a proxy and appearing to be in the UK processing a transaction when actually you pierce the proxy and they're based in Eastern Europe or somewhere high risk, for example. So it's understanding those different elements about the information that's being submitted alongside the identity that I think is really key.
Well, I also think in the digital world, we've chosen to create, or we've been forced to create multiple identities. Right. So if you work for a large company, you've got a work identity, and you're constrained by certain credential types and access privileges and limitations based upon that work environment. And then you've got a consumer identity that you've created in the digital world and that you're using as you choose. I for example, I have two consumer personalities. I refuse to have my banking information and my non-banking information secured by the same credentials and using the same identity tokens, just because I'm paranoid. Well, how many email addresses do you have?
The active one's 3.
Well, there you go.
That's just how
I mean, you're just doing email, right? So, I mean, do you need 3? So you've chosen to have multiple.
Right.
And so I think we create these different identities, sometimes by accident, but more often by design. And we assign different credentials to support those. And I don't think that's, so I mean, I appreciate there's islands of identity, and I think I'll speak for myself, I'm the cause of the problem, and I have no intention of solving the problem because it's not my problem, it benefits me.
Right, it's not a problem.
Yeah, I agree.
It's a state of being.
Yeah, so to the question from the previous panel about federated identities, good luck with that. I mean, who do you trust? I don't trust anybody. I'm not giving anybody the responsibility to do that. So.
Don't get your Internet of Things privileges revoked.
Maybe.
So fascinating discussion. One of the things I'm kind of curious about is when we talk about, islands of identity, right? The issue there is that there's sort of a factor of n here, right? There's multiple identities. To the topic of the panel, the Internet of Things, there's n number of devices, right? And then, as I claimed yesterday, I don't know if you guys believe me or not, but the Internet of Things is going to be monetized by commerce, so n number of payment credentials, right? That's a lot of dimensions.
A lot of ends.
A lot of ends, right?
Yeah.
And minus
That
1
ends
time.
justify the means.
But this is where the conflict of relationships becomes harder and harder to solve, right? We at MasterCard are already struggling with things like householding, right? In my wallet, I have 4 cards and 2 that I don't use frequently, so they're sitting in a drawer somewhere. That's 6 cards from one individual. Nobody knows that those 6 cards all belong to me, right? But if I knew that, I could match up the behavior patterns and do some of the stuff that you guys do frictionlessly, right? So, and that's just payment cards. That's n number of payment cards to one person. Now we're talking n number of digital identities as well, and then n number of devices to me as a person. What's the view on authentication there? Like,
Well, do you really? So there's value in authenticating what device you use and tying it to you based upon your user behavior patterns, right? And that happens automatically in the cloud with the technologies that Ovation has and others have. But then there's authenticating the user of that device, right? So there was talk yesterday about having your Samsung refrigerator order your food from wherever and then charge it on your automatic MasterCard. That's wonderful, okay? But if I'm the bank who issued that MasterCard, I could give a rip about authenticating the Samsung refrigerator. I want to authenticate the cardholder. Did he approve the refrigerator to make those transactions? Because the refrigerator is not going to be held liable.
exactly.
And Samsung's not going to be held liable. Either the bank is going to be or that user. And so I think we have to realize that in the context of the Internet of Things, it's really important to understand data integrity and the privacy of data and the security of data as all these devices talk to one another. There's going to be access privileges and all kinds of other stuff that has to be built into that infrastructure to make all that work. At the end of the day, the authentication is going to lie where the liability lies. And so as long as the liability for any purchase transactions, financial transactions in that world are going to be managed through the bank, and the bank is potentially liable, okay? Guess what? The bank is going to require reasonable authentication of the person that owns that credit instrument that's going to cause that payment to occur.
No, go ahead.
Okay, that's just one point on that, and actually you raised a really interesting point there. with the Internet of Things and with devices like smart fridges, you can even get smart kettles that you can switch on in the morning to say, by your phone to save yourself 30 minutes. One of the issues that we've really got here around authentication and identity is actually what level of protection is in place with those devices? How are those devices going to be updated to protect the consumers whose details they're utilizing? Because ultimately, by connecting to one of those devices, if a fraudster is connecting remotely, they're connecting into a Wi-Fi network that will give them access to the consumer's full information that they're submitting. So the Internet of Things itself represents an overall risk that the more devices you use, they struggle to keep your identity safe on an iPhone or on a laptop, let alone on a smart kettle or a toaster. Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting challenge that's going to keep growing.
I think one of the things that my observations, I listened to the discussion, is that a lot of times, and you see this especially on the vendor side, that a lot of assumptions about technology are 10 years old. And in fact, the bad actors are much more sophisticated than our security posture gives them credit for. For instance, IBM has a great white paper that's a little scary, and they talk about the fact that everybody talks about geolocation, source IP address, all sorts of machine identification, easily spoofed. And in fact, it's a little scary how much is dependent on those contextual factors when really it's just, as they say, security theater. And I think we sort of have to update our... Yeah.
It's about having an appreciation for what the fraudsters are trying to do. So you're absolutely right, geolocation. So if you're using IP address as an indicator, for 69p I can download an app that will put my IP location anywhere in the world. Or if I want to completely hide from you, I use the Onion router, Tor network, which will mask my location. And then you say, well, okay, I'll geolocate utilizing the GPS on your device. Well, I can spoof my GPS location as well. Oh, and well, we'll check the IMEI number on the device, and well, you can change the IMEI number. So the arms race that effectively you're outlining there is us as an industry attempting to stay a step ahead of the fraudsters, which from our perspective, we do by understanding those threats and developing countermeasures. So we're able to identify where those things are occurring, and we provide that protection so that we know that information can be changed, so we are aware of it, and therefore we put countermeasures to prevent that.
You're unique, by the way.
But for the rest of us, we run into really weird situations. Like, we just got a new, quote, smart TV. These things that listen in on your conversations.
Congratulations.
Yeah. But in setting it up, so I am. One of my identities is I'm a Mac fanboy. I have an iPhone, I have a Mac. Turns out this is an Android TV, and to just sort of set it up so it could be a TV and a smart TV, I used my Gmail address, one of those three that I have, and now, but everything else that's sort of e-commerce-y, it uses a different email address and has all these other things associated with that me that I didn't voluntarily set up, and it's really inconvenient to have the TV think I'm this other thing, and I don't even think about that, but that's what the Internet of Things is going to be. If it's like Russian roulette or just roulette in general, every time you pass a smart something and it figures out your handle. That's weird. I hadn't even thought about it to mention.
Yeah, the notion is, though, there isn't going to be, maybe those identities, those different identities can be mapped. That's not beyond the scope of technology to do that.
No.
But it's an extra step that oftentimes isn't thought about, that you're going to have to do.
The algorithm is going to have to take over. But did you expect that answer, Raghav, when you asked, of course, authentication gravitates towards liability, but like, does MasterCard, do you pass that on, or your member banks would,
So again, as you said,
Yeah.
liability and authentication kind of follow one another. And
Yes.
we don't have any financial liability on our balance sheet that's held at the bank.
I got the same answer from Visa too, so.
Funny how that works. But no, I think that there's something to be said about, you know, making sense of confusion and the consumer willingness to tolerate your inability to do so. Your being us, the industry, banks, retailers, whatever. And in the absence of our inability to make sense of this complex network of devices and systems and businesses and people and payment credentials and all of that, I worry that what we're going to do is go $5 worth of tomatoes. Wait a minute. Fingerprint, and then the consumer is just going to go, "Are you kidding me?" Right?
Right.
And that's the sort of thing that's just going to be completely not tolerable.
Right.
But equally, it is not an easy problem to solve. So you know, the classic risk versus reward, simplicity versus security kind of question comes up. And I just think that question becomes non-trivial to answer when you go from a one-to-one relationship between person, device, and payment credential, and all you're worrying about in numbers is your channel, right? Whether it's in-app payments or browser-based payments or whatever, to now everything is N, right? And I'm still obviously thinking through this in my head, and you know, it's really nice to have a sort of community of people who are we haven't solved this, but let's think about it together. Because I read this really interesting article a couple of days ago that said we're not competing against each other anymore. We're competing against market forces. Because the market itself,
or the algorithm.
right? The markets and the technologies are moving so fast that we're just struggling to keep pace with where the market's going. So I'm not competing against Visa, right? Where I'm competing against the next technology that's going to make, you know, say tokenization irrelevant. I don't know. And so let's collaborate a little bit more than we used to in the past.
Well, just if I can piggyback on the Internet of Things thing. I live in Silicon Valley. I'm surrounded by nerds and geeks. Okay, and yeah, I love it, to be honest with you. But this whole issue of like home automation, the nerds and the geeks in Silicon Valley grossly misrepresent what the rest of the world does in terms of home automation, because they just love this stuff, right? They're down at Radio Shack buying, you know, pre-intelligent, you know, remote controllers for light switches because they can turn them on and off from their mobile phone. You know, I mean, now the business benefit of that, the family benefit is really hard to reach, but just because they can. And so they're misrepresentative. But if you just project that a little bit farther forward and say, oh, I've got a Nest thermostat or somebody else's intelligent thermostat, I've got intelligent lighting systems, I've got intelligent, today there's TV advertisements running for home security systems that are wired into your network at home, right? So the security cameras, you know, around your house, which I'm not sure why you need, but you know, those are being advertised on television. And suddenly, so the geeks love this stuff and put it all together. But the mere mortals, the liberal arts majors, you know, going like, yeah, right? And so what happens though is they see something like Siri and Apple TV, and they see something like Amazon Echo, and they're going like, oh, okay, if I can do that, then all of a sudden this stuff might make sense.
And so the Alexa and the Echo exposes a lot of what's going on here, or what we should be talking about.
Yeah, well, and honestly, what we see there is at least in the public sector, in the public venue, a callous disregard from the vendors of that stuff for any kind of authentication aspects of that.
Right.
Right. I don't want the criminal breaking into my house, you know, in 3 years from now and saying, turn off the security cameras, Alexa, you know, and oh, okay. You know, no, let's leave them on. You know, sorry, you're not authorized would be a really good response to that, right? I don't want an underage child coming into the house and saying, hey, I want to watch the Playboy channel. right? There are parental controls, but does Alexa implement any of those? And does Alexa know the difference between the underage child and the adult, right? And so, and this is a place where if all the command and control stuff is seemingly migrating to a voice type user interface, can we use the voice that's being spoken to both authenticate users and to personalize systems? So to me, that's a great opportunity for the speech technology industry in whole, and in the verification side of that in particular.
So I think that there's a big issue, because we think about consumer applications, but there's more fundamental ones, medical devices, automotive, that aren't convenience. You know, what happens is these devices are developed for functionality, and then a network is bolted on because you have to update firmware. And none of these companies have any orientation surrounding security. There are no standards, and so the fact that somebody can log in and stop my pacemaker or drive me off the road are huge security exposures. There's no standards, no industry oversight, and I think that's the scary place. You know, my 5-year-old neighbor watches the Playboy channel. You get an early education, and you know the
Like you can't go on the internet? What?
I know that application's not as big as my heart. My heart just stopped.
Yeah.
Sure.
Wow.
That got really serious.
So the moral of the story is don't get a defibrillator. No pacemakers, you know.
I guess again though, back to the comment, it's around the layered approach. So if the father is asking the TV for that, if the kid records it, then have they got access to that from moving forward? So, but if the father is there, uses the voice and his mobile phone says in the same geolocation, then you've got 2 factors of authentication to know you're pretty certain that those 2 elements are together. So always, no matter what it is, my view, take the layered approach. Because if you're relying just on one sole element, you're probably going to get it wrong.
Well, if I can add on to that, there are, with passive voice authentication, with really what is passively to the user, device location and device profiling information, and there are other passive forms. The user experience impact of those is 0, as long as they're really passive. And so you can really implement a multi-layered security mechanism in a passive environment that does not trash the user experience. And that's where, you know, sort of the next wave of all this is. And we're starting to see that emerge in the call center at this point, right? And it'll extend in other places.
Yeah. I get this image that we will move sort of friction-free and seamlessly until we hit some sort of speed bump that is either totally unintended or part of some security scheme that, you know, turns out that you can say all that stuff to Alexa, but if you're ordering something, it says you must go to your Amazon, but you have to go to your Amazon app on your phone, or your Alexa app, or whatever it's called. So they do set up tiers of stuff that, so this concludes. I didn't want to end in the deep for somebody dying of a heart attack. So we moved to a cheerier place. And speaking of cheerier places, this is the end of the exclusive iOff track. We take a 15-minute break and reconvene over in the big room. We have a couple of panels then, and then you'll notice there were no speakers on the last panel because we're going to make it into something of a sing-along. We're actually going to turn to ourselves as subject matter experts and draw some conclusions about what's going on. So let's thank Tristan and Chuck.